Okay, are we?
Just 1 second still. Sorry.
No problem.
All right.
Excellent. Okay, get my gavel out, make it official. And good morning. I'm going to go ahead and call this session of the City of Lacey Hearings Examiner to order. For the record, today is October 18th, 2022 at 10 a.m., which is a Tuesday. We have one item on the agenda this morning. This is number 19-309, involving a request for approval of after-the-fact permits, including a shoreline substantial development permit, or SSDP, shoreline conditional use permit, or SCUP, and shoreline variance to allow for the retention of an installed concrete patio, bulkhead, and retaining walls, as well as for installation of a second dock on a 3.08 acre property at 2603 Carpenter Road Southeast, adjacent to Hicks Lake. My name is Andrew Reeves. I'm a hearing examiner with Sound Law Center, who the city has selected to hold certain land use application hearings like this one. And today it will be my role to collect evidence in the form of exhibits and testimony to determine whether this proposal is consistent with the city's comprehensive plan, zoning ordinances, critical areas ordinances, and because it does involve the jurisdiction of Hicks Lake, ensure that the proposal would be consistent with our State Shoreline Management Act, which is in Chapter 9058 of the Revised Code of Washington, the city's adopted Shoreline Master Program, or SMP, as well as the adopted regulations from the Department of Ecology related to the shoreline, which generally are in chapters 173, 26, and 27 of the Washington Administrative Code. So to that end, I received several exhibits in advance of the hearing that I had an opportunity to review. These include a staff report prepared by city staff, the application materials themselves, which included the various applications, information on the environmental checklist, environmental review that occurred, information of a technical nature, including critical areas reports that were prepared and geotechnical reports that were prepared, information on the notice that was provided in relation to the application, as well as today's hearing, information on the review that occurred under our state's Environmental Policy Act, or SEPA, including the determination of non-significance, or DNS, that was issued by the city. A few comments that were received from reviewing departments and agencies, including the Department of Ecology, and then some additional exhibits that were submitted on behalf of the applicant. And I think I have them all, but we'll check. There was a comment from a neighboring property owner, Deanna Joyner, as well as an additional technical report. But if there are additional exhibits, please let me know when it's your opportunity to speak or testify, and I'll go ahead and address admitting additional exhibits at that time. All testimony today will be under oath or affirmation. Ultimately, were the decision in this matter to be appealed, part of that record would be our recording from today, as well as my decision and the admitted exhibits. Here in the city of Lacey, at least currently, I do not make the ultimate decision on proposals. I'll be making a recommendation to the council, I believe. I want to make sure I didn't get that wrong today, but I know things are in motion. But as far as I'm aware, that is currently still the way things work in the city of Lacey, but I'll have staff verify that. So my plan then is to hear the testimony today, review the admitted exhibits, and produce a recommendation to the council, who would then have the ultimate decision to make on this proposal. And in terms of the order that we typically follow, and I believe we're going to follow today, is first I'll swear in city staff, who will give an overview of the proposal and the review process that led us to today's hearing. After that, we'll turn to, in this case, the applicant representative. They are represented by counsel today. So we'll turn to Attorney Heather Burgess after we hear from staff, and I'll have her maybe give her sort of opening thoughts, and then call on those she would like to call on, and then we'll see at that point if there are members of the public at large interested in testifying. There's the hybrid format being used today, so we do have staff members in the council chambers. So far, we do not believe there are any members of the public that have joined us in the council chambers or any additional members of the public that have joined us online. But when we get to that point in the hearing, we'll check. And if folks are interested in testifying, they'll have that opportunity. And then at the end, we'll return to the applicant team and city staff to respond to any such testimony. So those are the basics. I thank everyone for being here. Folks will generally remain muted until called upon to speak. But if you urgently do have something you need to say, we do have the raise hand feature enabled. So Ms. Burgess, I think normally we would keep you unmuted, but either way, I'm confident if you have an objection of some kind, you'll be able to figure out a way to convey that you would like to say something. So I think with that, we can get started and I'll get Samara Seymour sworn in. So thank you for being here. Do you swear or affirm to tell the truth in the testimony you give here today?
I do.
And if you could just state and spell your name for the record and explain your role here at the City of Lacey.
Sure. My name is Samara Seymour. That's Samra Seymour. And I am a senior planner for the City of Lacey.
Great. Thank you for being here.
All right.
Sorry, right at
No,
the
go
gate,
ahead.
I was going to say right out of the gate, in terms of
Mhm.
exhibits, I did go to the website last night because my office received an email from Grant Beck saying there were a few additional exhibits that were uploaded from the applicant. So I have the number at 10 right now, but are there more that have come since or?
Yes, there are. We received, I think it was 2 additional exhibits this morning from the applicant. And so I would just add those. I would just amend the exhibit list and add that to exhibit 10 to make those F and G, 10F and 10G. And those have also been uploaded to the website.
Okay. So they are there. I just haven't seen them. So my apologies
Correct.
for having not seen them yet. But
They just went up, so.
okay. I will certainly look closely at them in advance of my making any decision on the proposal.
Okay.
Okay, so we'll keep them within 10, but just to note, it will be F and G.
Correct.
Okay, excellent. With that, I'll let you take the floor. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I actually unless you're opposed, Mr. Examiner, I will probably, in the interest of time and the fact that we do not have, I believe, any public with us today, I'm not going to go really into too much detail. This staff, obviously, we have submitted our staff report to you, which I believe you've had the chance to review, and the applicant has as well. And so I will actually, I'll cede my time over to Heather, if you like, in terms of getting the hearing moving. I don't have any additional information to add to the record at this point.
Sure. Maybe just before we do that, if you could just sort of run through, I know you've got a summary in the staff report, but just
Okay.
a quick on sort of what in staff's mind seems okay, what doesn't, et cetera.
Okay, gotcha. Okay.
A full grasp on where we're at, and that hopefully will help
Okay.
Heather Burgess in making sure she knows what argument she would like to make. So
Okay, sure. So quick summary. We kind of in our staff report broke it down by the type of improvement. And so we looked at the bulkhead, which and as in our staff report mentioned, we came to the conclusion that it was a replaced bulkhead, which should require a conditional use permit, as staff wasn't able to make the determination of consistency with those regulations. So we've got a CUP and with options to either remove and replace with soft shoreline stabilization or to remain as is with additional mitigation in the vegetation management area. The gravel fill that was placed in the shoreline placement would meet the definition of development per the Shoreline Master Program, which would require a variance. By variance criteria, staff determined would not be met, and that gravel should be removed and replaced with native vegetation or some other type of approved knotweed management methods. There was an existing pathway on site, and staff recognizes that pathway has existed. But the grading, the amount of grading that was done to that pathway would require a conditional use permit for the grading and a shoreline substantial development permit for the restoration that would and will need to be done to restore that area that was graded. The second dock would require a variance because it does not, and which doesn't meet the criteria. All residential properties are required to have a joint use dock, and their existing dock would meet that requirement. The restoration of the vegetation management area as proposed by the applicant, that would require a restoration plan, and staff is also, staff's analysis determined that plan should be enhanced to address the bulkhead and the removal of the gravel and the patio. And then finally, the cement patio, which was installed without permits, would not be allowed. It doesn't meet the variance criteria and certainly would would be considered granting of a special privilege. It wouldn't be allowed to other uses on the shoreline. And actually, I apologize. I'm going to go. One other item I wanted to mention on the bulkhead is, and based on some of the exhibits that we just received from the applicant, I just want to reiterate that the staff does agree that there was some sort of shoreline stabilization of bulkhead there in the past. There's just some evidence, as was shown in the staff report, that bulkhead, even before it was replaced, was likely waterward of the ordinary high water mark. And so that's another thing that the CUP or the replacement would have looked at as if it had been done with the proper permits, is to establish where that ordinary high water mark was. So, and I think that hits all of the improvements that staff took a look at.
Sure. So I guess what I'm saying, were I to agree with staff's recommendation, I would end up producing a decision wherein a SCUP would be approved to either replace the bulkhead or leave it as is.
Mm-hmm.
Step one, is that right?
Correct. Yes.
Okay. Second, staff believes the gravel fill needs to go. So no gravel fill.
Correct.
Okay. Third, the pathway can remain, but it needs to fall under, again, the SCUP and SDDP.
Mm-hmm.
SSDP, that's the word I'm looking for. No second dock would be allowed. Do I make a conclusion, or where does the VMA or vegetation? So I'm trying to remember what the A stands for. I was thinking a plan. It's not
vegetation management area.
Yes. Where does is there a specific permit associated with a vegetation management area?
No. So just to clarify, the vegetation management area is the land between the ordinary high water mark and what is essentially the setback for any particular shoreline zone. In the case of the residential shoreline zone, it's a 50-foot setback. So the residential shoreline jurisdiction or area has a 50-foot vegetation management area. And the permit isn't for that per se. The permit is for the shoreline management plan requires a shoreline substantial development permit for ecological restoration work. So if you go into a shoreline and remove vegetation or replace it or do things that would enhance the ecological functions of a shoreline, that requires a shoreline substantial development permit, which the applicant has already proposed.
Got it. Okay. Now I get it. Okay. And then the cement patio, staff is of the opinion it wouldn't meet the criteria, so it would need to go.
Correct.
Okay. So, and then just to be clear, am I correct in thinking that a single SSDP would cover everything.
Yeah, yes,
Okay.
yes.
And to the extent that we're looking at, ultimately one sort of project, and then looking at the independent features, the analysis under either a shoreline variance or a shoreline conditional use permit would have to be individual to each feature, meaning, looking at whether a second dock is allowed is different. I should be looking at the variance criteria for that separately
Mhm.
from, the criteria associated with allowing gravel fill, something to that. Is that a correct assessment in staff's mind of how I should be thinking about these things?
I believe so, yes.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you for clarifying that. I may end up having questions for staff later, but I'm okay with the process you've proposed of moving to our applicant representative first, as it were. Did you have anything final before we move to Attorney Heather Burgess?
I don't believe so, no.
Okay, great. Thank you. So with that, we'll turn to our applicant representative. And as an attorney, I won't be swearing Heather Burgess in, but if she can just introduce herself, we'll need her to unmute as well.
Sure. Good morning. My name is Heather Burgess. Last name is spelled Burgess for the record. And I'm an attorney with the law firm of Phillips Burgess, and I represent the applicants for this particular project, Michelle Gusta and Ian Joyner, who are also present.
Great. Thank you so much for being here. And because I haven't had an opportunity to look, would you mind just giving me a very quick explanation of what those new exhibits were that were provided?
Certainly. So if I could, I'd like to just walk you through the additional, and I apologize if I've got barking dogs in the background that you can actually hear. My coworkers, the dachshunds today, are not being particularly cooperative.
I have a little judicial assistant that sometimes causes problems, so no problem at all. I get it.
Yeah. I chose the home office for internet stability that was better than my actual office. So this is the downside. So I do apologize if there's periodic interruptions. Doing my best here. In terms of the additional exhibits that were provided yesterday, I just wanted to walk through those for the examiner because we'll be referencing them in a bit of the testimony. I believe they were added as Exhibit 10. So the first part of that is the first 2 pages of that were Mr. Calendar's curriculum vitae. He's the one who prepared the applicant's shoreline report, and he'll be testifying today. Page 3 of that exhibit, which I think is maybe labeled B, 10B, was a brief biography of Mr. McCann, who is the author of the geotechnical report. However, one of the exhibits that we sent today was his more detailed curriculum vitae. So that would substitute for page 3. There was a supplemental or a revised quality of geo report from Mr. McCann, which was provided starting at page 4 of how it appears in the city's exhibits going through page 13. And that is largely the same as the exhibit that staff reviewed in conjunction with the original application, except there was a slight modification to the discussion regarding slope stabilization. So rather than prepare a supplemental report, he revised the original. So that's included in Exhibit 10 as labeled on the city site. And then pages 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, and 21 of the PDF that shows up as Exhibit 10 online are photographs that Ms. Gusta will go over this morning of their current photographs of their property. And then the last 2 pages of Exhibit 10 were the email from Ms. Joyner regarding who is the adjacent neighbor to the property, and she'll be addressing that as well. And then this morning we provided, as I mentioned, the more detailed CV for Mr. McCann, and we also provided additional photos from Ms. Gusta that she'll testify to today, which are from 2011 and 2017, respectively, showing different features of the property. So those are the applicant's additional exhibits. I do apologize for the late breaking news of a couple of them this morning. And I did want to point out, we'll address this a little bit with Mr. Calendar's testimony, but one of the staff recommendations has to do with revising the proposed restoration plan as the examiner noted in the opening and colloquy with Ms. Seymour, one of the features of this application is proposed ecological restoration of the shoreline and certain planting. Depending on the outcome of the examiner's decision, there would be additional potential restoration required. And we do anticipate that we'd have preparing and submitting, and we can discuss this at the end if the examiner prefers, a supplemental or proposed condition and additional restoration specific to the patio area of the property.
And
So
sorry, to that extent, Ms. Burgess, are you saying, were I to agree with staff and the patio, the concrete needed to go, you're saying you'd be prepared, you're prepared to produce a revised restoration plan that addresses that? Is that the concept? I don't want to put words in your mouth.
That's correct, including some specific timing of a proposed condition for the removal because of some of the complexity involved in removing it, as well as continued need to manage the knotweed in that area during its removal. And that would be prepared by Mr. Callender and submitted after the hearing. In an effort to try to avoid, having to condition the project for a future submittal that may cause later dispute with the city, we thought we would offer to submit that at the close of the hearing so it could be considered and responded to as part of this proceeding.
Okay, I think I get it. I think it makes sense. What I would suggest is perhaps we sort of work through your witnesses and maybe you make an argument as to why you think the patio should stay, and then we can address the if it isn't going to stay at that point. So it's kind of segmented. Would that make sense to you?
Certainly. I was just wanting to make sure I counted for all the potential exhibits that you might encounter. Excellent.
And yeah, to that end, I note, I guess I hadn't broken it down A through whatever in Exhibit 10, but I did review, it looks like A through E. So the only thing I have not yet seen is the CV for Mr. McCann and those additional photos. So
perfect.
Okay.
That concludes the kind of introduction portion of my remarks. So with that, I'd like to call Ms. Busta.
Okay. And I'm going to swear you, and are both of you going to be testifying? I can swear you both in and we'll take, no, okay. Well then just.
I'm the only one. Yeah,
You swear affirm to tell the truth in the testimony you give here today?
I do.
And if you could just state and spell your name for the audio recording.
Michelle Gusta, spelled MICHELLE-GUSTA.
Great, thank you for being here. Okay, and Ms. Burgess, go right ahead with any questions.
Great, thank you. And I perpetually misstate her name as Busta, and so this is just a problem for me. So I apologize for that in advance. Continue to do it. It doesn't matter how many times I'm corrected. Okay, can you explain, Ms. Gusta, for the examiner, how you and Mr. Joyner came to own the property that's the subject of this application, and then what condition it was in when you purchased it?
Yes. So the property that's adjacent to it was purchased by Steve and Deanna Joyner, who are the parents of Ian Joyner, my husband, in 1982. And they built their home and have lived on Hicks Lake. And Deanna Joyner still resides there. And so in May of 2017, there was a microburst, and a lot of the trees that were on 2603 Carpenter fell, one of which fell on 2511 Carpenter. And shortly thereafter, Ian and myself approached the owners in passing, and their names were Ken and Chris Dahl, and approached them if they were ever interested in separating from that property. It wasn't being maintained, and they were interested. And so December of 2017, we made a purchase under a as is deal and bought the land off of them, which has the condition in which it was received was there was still a lot of the fallen trees and it wasn't inhabitable at all. And in order to just use the dock, I think that was probably the nicest part of the whole property was that dock. And in order to get to it, summer of 2018, we started cleaning it up and picking up tree trunks and limbs, and the septics we thought would be repairable were not. We had to hook up to city sewer and water, and 2603, the actual house, was all rotted. So nothing was habitable. We did not even take residency until late 2018, and we resided in 2607 Carpenter. And just, it was overwhelming with relentless repairs, replacements, and then knotweed being brought to our attention by the county. So it's just been one thing after another. So needless to say, it's overwhelming.
And real quick, is there maybe an exhibit either for Samara Seymour or Heather Burgess as Ms. Gusta? Now you have me doing it. Ms. Gusta is testifying. I've heard several sort of addresses. Maybe if we have an aerial that shows, if we can put that up on the shared screen, I think that'll be helpful. So just while we're doing that, Ms. Gusta, did you all purchase one property, multiple properties? I recognize it's next door to the in-laws, but is it just one lot, multiple lots? Could you just clarify that for me?
It's one lot with 4 addresses on it. So it, yeah, can be a little confusing.
Gotcha. Okay. So there were some pre-existing non-conforming, I think described as ADUs on the property. And so was it that the main house was in bad shape and uninhabitable, and you were living in one of the ADUs that had an address? Is that what happened?
That is the case for all 4 of the units that were on there. Yeah.
Got it.
Mr. Examiner, I have an aerial of, it's a current aerial, if you'd like to have that.
That'd be fine with me.
I'm working on it.
I actually, we're all working on it. I was going to go, Mr. Calendar, to the 2.1 from your report, which showed the historical and
Yes.
current land use and actually points out the features. So
That's
if it's
what I was
okay for me to share my screen, Mr. Examiner, I'll do that. And then I can have Ms. Gusta walk through the different properties that she was just discussing and go over her property from the air, if that's okay.
That's fine. Yeah, I think, do you have the power? I think you might have the power. John, does she have the power to share screen?
Yeah, she should be able to share. her screen.
Okay, I certainly authorize Attorney Burgess to share her screen.
Okay, I'm trying to make sure that I'm sharing the right screen, so bear with me here. Oh my God, now I've lost it. Give me just a second. You'd think after all the Zoom, I'd be much more competent at this than I actually am.
We all should be, honestly. I mean, I have the least excuse of anyone. This is all I do all day, every day, but it still happens.
Well, it's just now what did I do with it? I really had it open, so give me just 1 second. Good grief.
But then they, every time they do an update, which is like once a week, it somehow
That's
nothing
true.
works anymore.
That's true. What I want to make sure is that this is big enough for it to be useful when it pops into the screen. So let me pull this up and share and see if it's readable for you. So I'm going to share this screen. Hopefully you're seeing an aerial and not pictures of my dogs or something otherwise random. Okay. Okay, so this is, and I'm going to scroll up just so you can see, this is figure 2 from Mr. Calendar's report that is part of the record. And then, Ms. Gusta, can you walk the hearing examiner through the different properties adjacent to your parcel that you were just referencing and point out the different features of your property?
I will do my best. Yeah. So the main road, there's Carpenter Road. So when you turn on our property entrance, it's a little out of order. So that's what makes this a
This
little
here?
unique.
Is that this here?
Right there.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
Yep.
We drive down the driveway and you're going to approach 2609 as the first address. And the one that you're pointing at right there is 2605. So there's trees that cover up where 2609 would be. And then it goes to 2605. And then the next building is 2607. And then the main house is 2603.
And is my cursor over the main house, the one that's labeled residence?
I believe
Or-
that is 2511.
That's 2511, right? So
Yeah,
this
so that's Deanna
this is the
Joyner's.
residence? Okay.
That is the residence, yeah.
Okay, great.
Okay, so just for my clarification, so if I'm headed, I turn off Carpenter and I'm headed, I think north. Okay, yeah, so I'm headed west. I'm first going to come to what I assume is a relatively small structure, 2605, that is in the trees, but to the south. Is that right? Not in the trees, but
No, that's 2609
is the first structure?
is the first structure,
Okay. So I missed that. Okay, so 26, but we can't see it. Is that right?
but we can't see it, correct?
Okay, so 2609, and then the first one I can see to the south of the driveway is 2605.
2605, correct.
Okay, and then there's a 2607 as well.
And then there, yep, 2607. Mhm.
And then the more substantial structure all the way to the west is the home, and that is 2603.
Correct.
Okay. But all of the ADUs are to the south of the driveway, right?
Correct.
Okay, and then your in-laws are north of you?
Correct.
Okay. All right, I think I'm oriented. Thank you very much.
You're
Mr.
welcome.
Examiner,
Yes,
can I ask a clarifying question?
certainly.
Is 2609 a mobile home unit?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and if it's helpful to keep this screen up, fine with me. If not, we can move on, but I interrupted Ms. Gusta's testimony, but now I think I'm well oriented as to where things are. So Attorney Burgess, however you think would make most sense, but if having her describe sort of the existing features now that we're down at the end where the home is, maybe it is useful to keep it up for another minute.
Right. So yeah, I'm not sure it has that much detail to be useful in terms of
Okay.
those features. And I have a couple other photos I'm going to review with her. So I'm going to take this off screen share for a moment, but I am going to pull up a couple other exhibits here in just a moment. So stop share. Okay. So Ms. Gusta, have you had the opportunity to review the staff report that was prepared by Ms. Seymour for this hearing?
I have, yes.
Okay, great. So I'd like to discuss a couple of the specific aspects of the application with you. And I'd like to start with the bulkhead. So you're familiar with the staff report's discussion of the bulkhead on the property. Is that right?
Yes. Correct.
And you heard Ms. Seymour's testimony and you're familiar with the conclusion that the bulkhead that's there today was a replacement, right?
I did hear that, yes.
Okay. Do you agree with that conclusion?
No,
And can you explain to the examiner why you disagree with that?
because it was there when we purchased the property.
And could you briefly describe the condition that the bulkhead was in when you purchased the property?
The bulkhead was eroding away. Unstable is a good word.
And so what did you do in order to address that issue?
Stabilize the rocks even when the kids would walk on it, even though I tell the children, no, don't do that, you could get hurt, they wobble. So re-stabilizing them so that it's more stable.
Okay. So at the time that you did that work, was the bulkhead already made of rock as opposed to
Yes.
cement? Okay. So I'm going to screen share again for a moment, Mr. Examiner, or I'm going to try. Give me a minute. I'm going to attempt my zooming function here. Okay, Ms. Gusta, can you see my screen here?
Yes.
Okay, can you describe for the examiner what this picture shows?
Cute
This-
children.
Other than your two cute children, relevant to this application, can you describe what it shows?
Yes, so the two children are on the dock located at 2511 Carpenter, that's Grandma's house. And you can see that the bulkhead back in 2011 is in the screenshot over at 2603.
And I've zoomed that in as best I can. This is one of the additional exhibits that was submitted this morning, Mr. Examiner. So this photo is in your record.
Sorry. And so if I were to, when I go into my record and I can zoom in more closely, I'll be seeing a bulkhead, let's say to the left of the, looks like blonder child's head. Is that what I would be seeing, is a bulkhead
Yes.
over that way? Okay.
In this area here, when you zoom
Got it.
in. Is that
Okay.
right, Ms. Gusta? That's what you're
Yes.
trying to show here, is these rocks? Okay, great. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing again, hopefully successfully. Okay. We've also provided the hearing examiner, and it's in Exhibit 10, with an email to you from Deanna Joyner that's dated October 16th. And I think we've already covered, but just for clarity of the record, is Ms. Joyner, your mother-in-law who lives next door?
Correct.
Okay. And she's lived there since the late 1970s, early 1980s?
Yes, 1982.
Okay, great. So the next thing I'd like to talk about, Ms. Gusta, is the pathway on the property. So there's a pathway that was described in the staff report, and that's part of this application, from your home down to the shoreline. Is that correct?
Yes.
And can you describe the condition of that pathway when you purchased the property?
It was full of holes and ruts.
And I'm going to screen share. I'm probably testing the limits of my ability, but I'm going to do it again. And this is another photo that was in the packet that went in this morning. Do you recognize this photo?
Yes.
And can you explain to the hearing examiner what this photo shows?
What this photo shows is back in June 2017 from 2511 Carpenter, you can see the pathway, which is pretty close on the property lines between the two, 2511 and 2603, that the pathway was already there.
And does that accurately reflect its condition when you purchased the property a few months later?
No, there was fallen trees when we purchased the property there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. But the width of the pathway was the
Further
same?
down. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
And the structure that's being constructed there in the bottom of the photo, what am I looking at right there to help me orient?
That is, I believe that was a back deck at 2511 Carpenter.
Okay.
So that's the adjacent parcel, correct?
Correct. Yeah, there was
Okay.
damage sustained from the microburst. That was part of the damage.
And sorry, for the record, can you explain what a microburst is?
To the best of my ability, I would describe it as a mini hurricane Tasmanian devil that took down a bunch of trees.
I like the explanation as a Tasmanian devil. I haven't heard that before, but I think
Yeah.
that I'll use that in the future.
Okay.
Excellent. Okay, sorry to interrupt. Go ahead, Ms. Burgess.
Oh, that's okay, Mr. Examiner. Yeah, I apologize for not going into more detail with that. It was discussed a little bit in the staff report. It was a somewhat unique, you might have encountered it in prior applications, but a somewhat unique meteorological event that occurred in the city of Lacey at that point in time. So, so regarding the pathway after you purchased the property, and can you explain in just a little bit more detail what you did to improve it, if anything, or repair or maintain it?
With the attempt to stabilize the bulkhead with those large heavy rocks potentially falling on a child, or because it's more shallow towards the shore, it required heavy equipment. So naturally the soft, it's almost like beach sand soil, that heavy machinery just going down the pathway compacted the sand down, and those ruts kind of filled themselves. So in my opinion, there was no intentional grading. It's just the weight and the compact from, I don't know what you call them. It's not a bulldozer, but it's
Excavator.
Okay.
there we go. Excavator. Thank you.
Okay. So you didn't perform any additional grading and filling in the area?
No.
Okay. And after the work was concluded and these proceedings started with the city of Lacey, did you have an opportunity to do any planting or restoration in that area already?
The pathway.
Yes.
Carlos with the city of Lacey, because we had our remodeling permit, had advised us to seed it because we had erosion issues that started coming about after Thurston County telling us to treat knotweed, which then killed off all the vegetation. So he had us lay hay, I think, or maybe it was straw, and that became slippery. And so with that slope, it became unsafe. So he had us plant grass.
Okay, so subsequent to the equipment going down in conjunction with the construction and remodeling of your home, there was grass planted in the area.
Yes.
So as we sit here today, is it accurate to say that the photos in the staff report from 2019 showing the alleged grading condition, those don't accurately reflect the condition of the property today? Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. So I'm going to share screen again, tempting fate. And what I'd like to do now, Mr. Examiner, is I'm going to go through each of the photos that were submitted that are part of Exhibit 10. In the PDF version of the exhibit, they start at page 14. And what I'm going to have Ms. Gusta do is go through and describe for you what each of these photos show, because they represent the existing conditions on the property.
Sure. And while you're putting that up, Ms. Gusta, when you were talking about the excavator being used to go down the path and to stabilize or repair that bulkhead,
around when was that timeline wise?
I think actually in the exhibit photo, you can see a picture of that piece of equipment down there. And that would be that time frame. Since
Okay.
then, there's been nothing.
Right. And
Going
I
down.
think what she's referring to is exhibit figure 5 in the city staff report at page 16, which shows a piece of equipment down on the shoreline, which was taken in September of 2019.
Okay,
Okay.
29. Got it.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to do this one more time, and then Ms. Gusto, we're just going to walk through the photos, and for each one, we'll go through and describe what they show for the hearing examiner. So I'm going to start here with the one that's in the PDF at page 14, Mr. Examiner. And Ms. Gusto, can you describe what this photo shows other than the dog?
That's Klaus. And what you see is towards the bottom of the steps, we have this throughout the property, and that's the soil type, and it actually is a great example of what's going on down by the bulkhead. And that's what we were trying to readjust rocks for, is you can see that the soil just kind of washes away. So we have a lot of erosion control issues along our hillsides.
Okay, and can you explain for the examiner what the perspective of this photo is, meaning where it's taken from relative to the shoreline and the property?
At the it's probably 55 feet from the shoreline.
Looking back up to your home, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to move to the photo and this is the current condition of the property today. Is that right?
Yes,
So this photo was taken recently?
yes, that was taken 2 days ago.
Okay, great. Then move to the photo that is at page 15 of the PDF. I'm going to zoom a little back out so that it has a better perspective. So was this taken on the same time 2 days ago?
Yes.
And can you explain for the examiner what perspective this is from? So where are you on your property and what are you looking towards?
You are a little bit past that final step from the main house that we just saw from the previous photo, and you're looking down, going down towards the lake. So you're probably at about 46 feet from shoreline.
Okay. And this grassy area that's shown in the photo, is that the path in its current condition?
Yes, that is
Okay.
the pathway.
All right. And so in your earlier testimony, you mentioned, I think it was Carlos from the city directing you to plant and do erosion control in this area. Is this the area
Yes.
we're talking about? Okay.
Yes. If I may comment a little bit further down where you see almost like there's dead spots. So there's one closer to the frame, but further down towards the lake.
In this area
Yeah,
here that I'm showing with my
Yes.
cursor? Okay.
yes. You'll also see that the hillside is eroding away right there, which makes it difficult when sand's on top of grass to grow. So we have that there happening too.
Okay. Was there anything else you wanted to point out about this picture for the examiner?
I feel the need to point out that the city comments on grading the pathway, and there's no, in my opinion, there's no way to really grade or widen or anything when you have a hillside and trees on the other side. So just again, that there was no improvements done to this pathway other than some compaction, which would happen with heavy machinery, and seeding under Carlos's direction.
Thank you. I'm going to go to the next photo, which is at 16, or at least I'm hoping I get to the next photo at 16. Okay, was this also taken a couple of days ago, 2 days ago?
Yes.
And can you describe for the examiner what perspective this shows? So where you're standing, again, relative to the shoreline and other areas of the property.
Yes, you're probably 35 feet from the shoreline.
And is this further down the path that was depicted in the previous photo?
Yes.
Is there anything else you wanted to point out here? And up in the forefront of the photo where my cursor is marked, is that the patio area that's the subject of this application?
That is the patio, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and again, I want to point out that with the soil, just having lived there now for 5 years, that the soil type, you can see just the hillside, treating knotweed and just not having that vegetation. We're having hillside stabilization, and as probably we get further down closer to the patio, I don't have those same issues with the hillside where the patio is. It's almost like it's, you know, when there's falling books, you have a book holder. So it's kind of my little hillside book holder there.
Okay. So I'm going to go to 17, and can you explain to the examiner, this was also taken 2 days ago, I assume?
Yes.
Okay, and can you explain to the hearing examiner what perspective this shows and features on your property?
Perspective is probably 20 feet from the shoreline. And you can see the bulkhead above the water line there. So now it's more visible, and that's where, you know, that's when we get our opportunity to kind of restabilize the bulkhead when it's above water. And that's when the children like to run across it and be my stabilization testers.
Understood. Anything else about this photo you wanted to share with the hearing examiner?
Not that I can think of.
Okay. I think we've turned around and we're likely going back uphill at this point. Is that
Yes.
accurate, Ms. Gusta? Okay. So can you explain to the examiner where perspective this is on your property?
This is probably 20 feet from shoreline, so we're just turned around. And it looks like, if you can see lower down on the left side of the photo, yep, there's some hillside stabilization. That was all there prior to, we've never touched that. So that was all there prior to acquisition of the property. And we don't have much of one effectively on the other hillside, which is.
And by the other hillside, you mean the other side of this
That,
path?
yes, yes.
Okay. And then this is the same path we saw earlier that's been revegetated with the grass. Is that accurate?
Correct. That is
Okay.
accurate. Yeah.
Okay. We have a couple more here. I think we've moved further back up the pathway, headed towards
Correct.
your house. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Okay. And other than the dog again, who really makes quite a great cameo, what is this photo intended to show?
Need for hillside stabilization. And you can see areas of weakness that, you know, we need more to it.
Okay. And
that is a huge area of concern, as you can see the washout, and it really depicts the type of soil that we have on the property.
Right. But it's correct, Ms. Gusta, that this area isn't the subject. This area, meaning the area shown in this photo at the page 20 of the PDF, we're not proposing any additional improvements to this area with these applications, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So these are just merely to show the existing condition of the property and your current soils. Is that right?
Yes. However, I mean, there's going to be a need. This is kind of the overall real life that as time goes on, we're seeing that this is showing in this area today, but, you know, we also have it over by where the patio area is as well.
Right.
So it's ever changing and sliding and moving.
Understood. But we haven't, I want to make sure for the examiner, when he's looking at the different elements of your application, the current application doesn't propose any improvements to this other than as associated with the restoration plan.
That's correct.
Okay. And then what's this last picture, Ms. Gusta? Is this just a closer up version
closer up.
or, okay, view of the prior photo?
Hmm.
Okay. And that's page 21 of the PDF. So that concludes the photos that we submitted of the existing conditions. I'm going to take this off screen share one more time. So the last area I want to cover with you, Ms. Gusta, is kind of the condition of your property relative to the adjacent properties. So did you have an opportunity to review the staff report discussion of that subject?
I'm not sure I understand which one you're referring to. Was there a specific analysis to an adjacent property or just the general comment of other properties?
So there was some discussion in the staff report at page 13 about your property relative to the adjacent properties and whether it was similar or different. You recall that part of the staff report?
Yes, I do recall.
Okay. So can you explain for the examiner whether you have an opinion about whether your specific property and its soils are similar to or different from the adjacent property?
My opinion is, and my experience has been that the other adjacent property may have different materials used to stabilize their hillside, but they do not necessarily have the same soil type and they do not have the same knotweed experience. So our property is certainly unique and absolutely complex.
Okay. And can you explain in a little bit more detail for the examiner? We've had several references to knotweed. So can you explain in a little more detail kind of your we'll call it the knotweed problem and the challenges that you've faced trying to manage that?
Yeah, so the history behind our knotweed extravaganza has been, we received in our mailbox, I can't off the top of my head remember how long ago, but I would say it was between 2018 and 2019. We received from Thurston County a notice that there was knotweed observed on our property and it's easily spread, and it was our duty to contain it before it's spreading or potentially be responsible for it spreading to other people. So we contacted somebody locally that handles Japanese knotweed, and they came through and said, well, nothing's gonna live, but when you get an official notice that states you have an obligation to correct something, whether you like it or not, and we did, and the city of Lacey became aware of it, and they were upset because there's certain rules and regulations about treating knotweed with shoreline when having a shoreline, which we didn't know. And so the city of Lacey, I believe it was SAMRA specifically, that contacted Thurston County to inform them that they need to not handle it the way they did with us because we acted upon it as instructed. And so that has been our ongoing extravaganza, like I said, is trying to have stabilization while treating knotweed and it not spread, but then learning this is like a 3 to 7 year type thing to see improvement.
Thanks, Ms. Gusta. And I just refer the examiner for context. Exhibit 3E to the staff report is the notice, which staff included, is the notice that Ms. Gusta was referring to from the county's noxious weed program. that initiated the knotweed removal. And that is that it's got several pages as well as the notice that was issued to them on a noxious weed survey. So that's what she's referring to. It's already in the exhibit. The last thing, Ms. Gusta, is, just want to confirm your application does include a proposal to do some revegetation and restoration activity on your property in various areas. So you're familiar with that plan, correct?
Yes.
And it's my understanding that revegetation was requested by the city of Lacey in order to respond to some of the alleged violations on your property. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And so are you and Mr. Joyner prepared to implement that revegetation and restoration plan in the event that the application is approved?
Yes.
Okay. Is there anything else that I might have missed that you want to share with the hearings examiner regarding your property or your application?
Is this like an overall closing? My last words?
Well, the nice thing about administrative proceedings, Ms. Gusta, is they tend to be a little bit more relaxed in terms of last words. So I'm sure if there was something else that came up, Mr. Reeves would accommodate that. But just in the event that I've missed anything that you wanted to ensure was in the record, I wanted to make sure you had that opportunity here.
I understand. No, I think I'm okay.
Thanks, Ms. Gusta.
And actually, to that end, this is somewhat unusual, and it's not an appeal hearing, but because of the nature of how complicated things are, I was curious to see if Samara Seymour had any clarifying questions she wanted to ask, not cross-exam, but just, now that we're, I think, more fully understanding things. But Samara, did you have any questions? I just wanted to make sure.
I do just have one
maybe you would.
question. Yeah, let's see. Well, just for it's kind of a clarification question. So let me my staff report up here. Bear with me a moment.
Is Klaus friendly, and does he want to be my best friend?
Exactly, that was it.
Okay.
You beat me to it.
Guessing yes.
So going back to the question about the bulkhead, Ms. Gusta testified that it was a repair, and so there are multiple areas in the report, Exhibit 4A, I believe, that talked about replacement of the bulkhead, but specifically page 26, it talked about, let's see, replaced a hard cement structure with somewhat softer rock, amorphous rock, and beach inset. And so that just sounded contradictory to what Ms. Gusta just testified to. So I just wanted to clarify that both for staff's understanding and for the hearings examiner.
Sorry, what was the question?
Oh,
or maybe.
So yeah, I'm sorry, I'll be a little more clear. So I thought that Ms. Gusta just testified that it was a repair that the bulkhead was repaired, and the SMP has very specific definitions of repair, versus what was stated in Exhibit 4A, I believe, specifically page 26, that talks about the bulkhead that has replaced a hard cement structure with somewhat softer rock. And so I'm asking for clarification exactly on if it was repaired or replaced, or what was there a cement structure there, or was it always rock? Because it seemed like we had some contradictory statements.
In terms of the bulkhead, there was no concrete.
Okay.
Okay, did that?
Yeah, that replaces. I would just say that just probably corrects a statement from Exhibit 4A.
Right, which is not something that she prepared, but your understanding
No.
is that it was never a
concrete bulkhead, it was rock, and then
Yes.
the repair was
yes.
adding more rock, right?
Exactly, because like I said, I relied on some of my, I referenced that in my staff report, so I was clarifying for both my understanding and for yours, Mr. Examiner, so.
Okay. Okay, so Heather Burgess, for the moment, did that conclude testimony from Ms. Gusta? You
I know.
said it the
Okay.
one way
Sorry.
the beginning, and then it
I
gets in
know.
my brain. I apologize.
Been my issue the whole time for a couple of years now, actually. Yes, that concludes Ms. Gusta's testimony.
Okay. And then your next witness you intended on calling?
My next witness is Alex Callender, Land Services Northwest.
Okay. And Mr. Callender, I'll swear you in. Do you swear or affirm to tell truth in testimony you give here today?
I do.
And if you could just state and spell your name for the recording.
My name's Alex Callender, ALEX CALLENDER. I'm the principal owner and biologist for Land Services Northwest.
Thank you for being here.
Yes.
Okay, go ahead. And Ms. Gusta, we may meet you and if we want to hear from you later, we will certainly reach out, or if you have something, you can use the raise hand feature, but we're not going to have a lot of jumping in and out, but if there's a final thought at the end, we could probably do that. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. With that, Heather Burgess, questions you have for this witness?
Thanks, Mr. Examiner. Mr. Callender, could you just start by doing a brief review of your specific kind of qualifications and experience, please?
Yes, I've been in environmental consulting and regulation for about 18 years now. I spent 8 years with the Department of Ecology as a wetland and shoreline specialist in Pierce, Thurston, and Lewis counties. And I reviewed all the shoreline permits for SEPA review and for conditional and variance approvals. And shortly after I left in 2016, I went to work for Pierce County as a biologist concerned with the shoreline management in Pierce County. And I did a similar function as SAMRA, where I reviewed shoreline work and permits and applied them to the consistency requirements. So
Thanks, Mr. Callender. And you're just direct the hearing examiner to Mr. Callender's curriculum vitae, which is in the first part of Exhibit 10 that was admitted. And I'd like to offer Mr. Callender as an expert witness in wetland biology and application of Shoreline Management Act regulations.
Okay, I have no issue there. Any Seymour, any issue from the city and that's witness being treated as an expert? None on my end, certainly. So looks like no issue. We'll treat him as an expert.
Thanks, Mr. Examiner. So Mr. Callender, can you explain what your relationship is to this particular application and describe any reports that you have prepared?
So my job as a biologist was to evaluate the shoreline and the structures and development that has occurred and apply it to the consistency with the Shoreline Management Act and the local shoreline master program.
And did you do that for this particular application?
I did.
Okay. And you prepared a report that appears as an exhibit, is that right?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And just for purposes of the record and the hearing examiner, the critical areas and shoreline report dated February 23rd, 2022. Is that correct, Mr. Callender?
That is correct.
And that's exhibit 4A to the current record. Have you had the opportunity to visit the property?
Yes, I've visited it a few times now. And during my visits, I looked at the condition of the vegetation was the first apparent issue, as they had treated the area for knotweed and blackberries. There's some English ivy and for invasive species, probably some other weedy species which aren't so egregious and environmentally damaging. The knotweed, of course, is a very difficult weed to get rid of and can be very problematic. It likes aquatic environments. It tends to crowd the near shore and displace other native plants. And the root structure is very dense, and it creates huge thickets of monotypic stands of the weed. So removal is often just is, I guess, the medicine's as bad as the cure's as bad as the ailment there. So they typically have to kill nearly everything with a broad spectrum herbicide. And because of that, I noticed that there were some areas that the sandy soils weren't holding together as well as they should with a native vegetation. Of course, the type of herbicide they use doesn't target the woody species, so most of that was intact. There's still ferns and things like that. The second thing I looked at was the pathway, and I noticed it was obviously had been used and had some kind of grading at some point, but notice that looking at the large Douglas firs, you can see at the base of the firs that there was no soil piled up in a manner that would indicate that it was recently graded. The trees appeared to be there for quite some time, and they used the trees more as a stabilizing feature, I guess, and an edge for the pathway. So, and of course, Mr. Joyner had explained that they brought some equipment down there to work on the bulkhead, and I'd like to clarify that my initial understanding of what was done with the bulkhead was that it was incorrect, and it wasn't until later that I was able to. Part of the issue we've had with supporting our arguments is the photographs of the area aren't very good. It's difficult to find old photographs of the bulkheads and the pathways because the trees were there until the microburst and covered much of the path. I have got some aerials that show portions of the path, but it's hard to get an overall picture. And I think, though, that the pictures that Ms. Gusta showed are pretty good for showing the position in the landscape and with regard to the existing vegetation and the points I just made about how there isn't any unnatural piling of the dirt against the trees. So as we worked our way down, of course, we noticed the soils are very fine sandy soils and somewhat unconsolidated, very prone to erosion. And I'm surprised that the hillside's been as stable as it has over time. If you look at some of the trees, and I have some photos that I'd like to show later, but some of the trees are what they call pistol butt, which is a primary indicator of a somewhat unstable hillside or hillside creep. And that's noticeable along the hillside, that the hill has been creeping downward due to gravity. And as you come down, there's a level area with the newly placed cement patio and the attached retaining wall that's set into the hillside somewhat. And the bulkhead is evident. And of course, the knotweed was starting to pop up. It was kind of the spring, if I recall, or actually, it was anyhow, the knotweed and blackberries were popping up here and there, as they tend to do. That initially, when you hit them with the herbicide, you may have a dieback, but typically within a few years, it seems like it all starts popping up back up again. And so you have to be diligent about the application of herbicide for a period of time. And it's not so clear to me that there, unless you are diligent, that there will be any end to it. And I think that Augusta and Joyner have been very good about their treatment of this vicious weed. And it would encroach on other people's properties. It's easily spread by ducks, animals, things like that. And little fragments can pop up. And they have kind of worked in the public interest to maintain their property that was in neglect and knock this stuff back. So I kind of have to add, as a former shoreline administrator on the regulatory side, when I come on to properties, it's hard not to have a little, I don't know, oftentimes the people on the shoreline are not typically knowledgeable about environmental issues. And so I expect sometimes that they don't understand the issues, but they were very interested in maintaining the shoreline in a good condition. And they have kids, and they surely enjoy they understand the value of the shoreline, and they use the shoreline for the boating and relaxing on the shoreline. And they're very interested in making their shoreline usable. So that was refreshing. So I would like to show a little bit of a little presentation as PowerPoint, and I don't think it has anything objectionable in it. Most of it's been viewed before, but I just wanted to give it a different context, maybe.
Yeah.
If
No
that's all right.
issue.
Okay. So I'm going to share my screen if I can.
And then Mr. Calendar, after the hearing, can we have the PowerPoint submitted so it's part of the record?
Yes.
Okay.
So
Sure. So we'll make,
typically, I would have this available. Let's see here.
we'll make this exhibit 11 ultimately.
Yeah, I might. Let's see here.
Thanks, Mr. Examiner.
Uh-huh.
Hmm. And here we go. Let's see. Boy, I'm really having a difficult time here. Oh, here we go. There we go. I was missing. There we go. Can you see that? All right, let's see. So I'm just gonna leave it like this. This is a hillshade LiDAR. And unfortunately, as I mentioned, we were having, I was having a difficult time finding good photos, or even the LiDAR in this area was not showing much detail on the shoreline to show the pathway. But this is good at displaying what the hillside looks like. As you can see, it's rather steep, and with erosive materials, it does is prone to slide, which the geotechnical report talks about in detail. And as they had already mentioned, this is a very good picture of the material, and it tends to spill out anywhere it's not doesn't have vegetation or is not contained. So anytime you break open the surface, you're inviting erosion without active erosion management. So, and then the city packet here, we have a picture of the bulkhead, and that shows the rocks and the area that they drove the equipment. As Ms. Joyner mentioned, or Ms. Gusta mentioned, they didn't do any grading, and it seems like this is naturally transitioning into the vegetation. There isn't any steep area right there. So this is from the Thurston County Inventory and Characterization. It talks about the water levels in Hicks Lake are typically low during the summer months. And what that does is that creates a condition where a typical bulkhead is going to be left landward of the water, and the erosion that occurs from the boat traffic from recreation creates undercutting and an unstable surface where the bulkhead, virtually any kind of bulkhead, a cement bulkhead or rock bulkhead, or virtually any bulkhead, because it's not protected area anymore unless they were to armor that, is subject to erosion because it's underwater for the whole rainy season, spring, and then during the summer months when we have the boat wake and things like that, it tends to undercut the bulkhead and create the unstable condition that Ms. Gusta was talking about. And it also mentions that it gets extreme high lake levels, which cause flooding of some of the lake shore structures. And I believe that they have a picture that shows the bulkhead nearly underwater and the waterward of the shoreline. And that is caused by what I believe is what's called a Pacific decadal oscillation, which creates a condition for lakes where you have periods of wetness and periods of dryness over time, over extended periods of time. And as you may know, the ordinary high water mark, which I used to teach a class for professionals on the ordinary high water mark. I've trained a lot of city and county staffs, and it's a mark upon the land with respect to vegetation where water occurs, and it is allowed to change with time. It's not a static point. And so, as you can see here, this is 2018, I believe. Let's see here. Yeah, I believe this is 2018. And you can see the lake level. This is a Hicks Lake hydrograph, and the lake level is quite high. And as we go to I'm sorry, that was 96. So this is, my eyes aren't working very well today.
That looks like 20.
Well, this is 2018. If you notice 2018 here, the hydrograph is quite low. So I've noticed on other lakes, like for example, American Lake, where they'll have a bulkhead, and then waterward of the bulkhead, you have 6 to 8 inch trees growing because the lake is drying up over time, and which is similar to what we're seeing here. And here's the 21, which is quite a bit lower. So, of course, you get a rise of about 4 inches, or yeah, about 4 to 6 inches over the wet period. I'm sorry, 4 to 6 feet. And so you have quite a difference in the levels, and so finding the ordinary high water mark has moved waterward over time, and I don't know if they have. It's really difficult to say whether they have moved the bulkhead. It seemed like it was a similar bulkhead in form and function. They do allow for the repair is allowed to, as long as it's following the function and purpose. I think it would meet that. Although I'm not sure that there's a real, of course, they need a conditional use permit, and I think they could apply for that underneath this through this hearing, but I don't know that it's necessary. It seems like they just took what they had and stabilized it. So that was the mention in my report about the cement was just a basic misunderstanding when I originally started writing the report. It was over a period of time that we worked on this project, or the report, and later on I found out through the photographic record that it was a regular bulkhead, or a rock bulkhead. So it sounds like Ms. Gustas explained that they just stabilized what they had, and it seems to be performing well. Of course, with the fine sandy soils and the fact that they've already had a lot of the sand eroding into the lake, it doesn't seem like the addition of the gravels is a bad thing. And the type of gravel they use is actually somewhat, it's round and would be utilized by fish if it fell into the water, for bass like to make nests and things like that out of it. But it seems to be holding in place, and it does keep the knotweed out of the near shore. We are recommending to do vegetative restoration in that area, in which we'll use one of the concepts I'm using in that area is that we have things like vine maples and other trees and shrubs that would hang out over the water somewhat. And what that does is it creates a situation where your macroinvertebrates climb out on the tree limbs, and inevitably some of them fall into the water. And they've done studies in Minnesota and other areas that show that these allochthonous inputs, they call them, are super beneficial for the fish in the water, and that lakes with these features, actually, they've done studies of what the fish are eating, and the macroinvertebrate inputs are a substantial part of their overall diet. So that's what we're trying to accomplish with our restoration plan on that near shore there in that gravel area. But I really don't see any reason for removing it, as it keeps the fine sandy soils away from the erosive forces of the water. And if they were to end up in the water, it's somewhat of a fish mix and would actually benefit the fish for creating their nests and stuff like that. So, and this is about the best picture I could get from Google Earth of the shoreline pre building of what they've got there. So, I think that's all I've got for that portion of what I wanted to talk about. So I'm gonna unshare. If I could, one thing that I wanted to talk about is that, so they have this. Can you see that now? Am I sharing that?
You're sharing the
Oh,
same
no, okay.
last
Okay,
photo that
sorry.
you had before.
This is just figure 2 from my report. Maybe Heather, can you share that? Let me unshare my screen.
Sure.
Here,
The same aerial that we started off the hearing with. Is that what
Yes.
you're wanting? Sure.
Yes.
Hold on.
I think. Oh, there's my. How do I stop sharing there? There we go. Okay. Yeah, if you could just show that. Oh, here, I can probably do it actually.
Nope, I have it.
Just one person at a time.
Okay. I guess that's not as good. What I wanted to do is show the patio there. So there's a very small area to actually enjoy the shoreline there, and they have kids and stuff that use this patio. The city of Lacey does allow for water enjoyment use. I understand that the variance criteria are very difficult, but the Shoreline Management Act is a balance of, the limited development and maintaining the public interest, but it does allow for water dependent uses, which City of Lacey really gets down to brass tacks as far as the difference between water dependent, water enjoyment, water related, and things like that, which is an interesting take on things. But looking around, I know we're not supposed to look around at other development as a method of justifying what we're doing here, but it's understandable considering many regular citizens don't understand the nuances of the Shoreline Management Act. They look around at their lake and they see other developments, and this lake is highly developed, has a lot of, most shoreline administrators have to keep blinders on because they just go walking around looking at violations. But there are literally from property line to property line decks on this lake, and looking around, I could say, oh, that's something that I would want, because I've got kids that we really enjoy the lake. We've got a boat. This would allow us to use the lake, and the extent of his development is relatively minor, and the amount of enjoyment and use they get out of it is relatively high, and I think there are ways we could mitigate it. The removal is difficult as well. It's a cement structure. Removing as the geotechnical report mentions, is we're going to need some kind of stabilization techniques done in the near shore, regardless of whether it's there or not. So balancing the costs, the difficulty, and the results from removing it, just like with the bulkhead, the Department of Ecology had mentioned that, removal of the bulkhead may create more problems than it solves. And so I'm not condoning the unpermitted use of this. I think it was relatively innocent type of thing. They had cement available. It goes downhill very easily with a sluice. They were able to use it for a purpose which is actually something that for the use of the shoreline and enjoyment of the shoreline. And so if we can keep it, I think they should. Balancing all the different factors, I think that ultimately it was not a thumb in the eye of the local government to put this down there. They were just trying to do something they thought would help them enjoy their property. So.
Okay. Did that conclude your thoughts for the moment? I'll see if Heather Burgess has additional questions.
I just had a couple. I'm not sure where the echo is coming from. Everybody hear me okay? All right. So I just had a couple clarifying questions, if that's okay, Mr. Examiner. So you referenced in your testimony Ecology's comments about leaving the bulkhead in place. Do you recall that testimony? Oh, you just put yourself on mute instead of taking yourself off.
Oh, yes, I do. There you go.
And on page 9 of the staff report, the staff suggests that the bulkhead be allowed to remain in place if there's additional vegetative restoration. You're familiar with that recommendation?
Yes, I am.
Okay. So you discussed a little bit about the proposed planting in that area. In your opinion, is the proposed revegetation and restoration plan adequate as it is to mitigate the impacts of that bulkhead, or is additional vegetation needed beyond what's proposed in order to address the concern that additional mitigation should be provided for the bulkhead improvement?
I think we are providing mitigation at a density, vegetation density that's typically required for this kind of restoration. We have a tree, a shrub, and a ground cover component. And the purpose of the ground cover, the kinnikinnick, is to drape over the bulkhead rocks and make it blend in with the surroundings. I've mentioned some of the trees that we're using would be the vine maples, and I think I've got some Pacific. Let me look here. But so I'm trying to have some flowering shrubs, and there we go. Quaking aspen, deciduous, has leaf litter, and aesthetically it's very striking in the fall, and for visual effect. And the salal, which has berries and flowers that will attract bees and bugs, and again create allochthonous inputs which will benefit the fish. So for the amount of square footage, we're talking 216 square feet. I use a Sound Native plant calculator to determine the density for the shrubs, trees, and ground cover. So that's what is recommended.
Okay, so in your opinion, is additional vegetation needed in the bulkhead area to retain the bulkhead?
No, there's a lot of vegetation we're putting in there.
Okay.
I can't see any way we could put more in without creating competition for what's there, you know.
And I just direct the examiner specifically to figure 6 in Mr. Calendar's report, as well as page 26, which describes the specific vegetation that's proposed for the bulkhead area.
Okay.
I think that's all I had for Mr. Calendar. Obviously, his report goes into more detail. It does review the different specific approval factors for each element of the application. And so I'd commend that to the examiner for more detailed analysis of the relevant code. But that concludes, otherwise, subject to the examiner's questions or any by Ms. Seymour, that concludes the applicant's presentation. Thank you.
Sure. And Ms. Seymour, did you have any clarifying questions of this witness on behalf of the city? I know it's unusual, but we did it last time. I just thought it'd be worth asking.
I don't know.
Okay, thank you then. Can Mr. Calendar be excused if he has other things he needs to do? I didn't have any specific additional questions. I think the report's pretty thorough and we've got clarification through the testimony. Are we done with him if he needs to go?
We are done with Mr. Calendar from my perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. You're certainly welcome to stay, Mr. Calendar, but if you have other things you need to do, feel free to move on. But thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Okay, so with that, I just want to check in with you, Heather Burgess. I think it would be helpful to have you sort of give me an argument, as it were, as to the elements and why you believe the applicants met their burden or whatnot. You know, as far as, let's just make sure, I don't think we have any other members of the public that have joined. I don't see any on virtual, and I'm getting the shake of the head here. And so in terms of testimony, I think we would be at the end. Substantively, I would enjoy a short restroom break if nobody else minds, maybe just a few minutes to gather your thoughts. And if we come back, say in like 10 minutes, if that's convenient, then maybe you can just give me sort of an argument, as it were, as to why the applicant feels it's met its burden. And then we can hear from Sam or Seymour, you know, if there's any additional thoughts from the city, and that'll wrap it up. Does that all make sense?
That's fine. Thank you.
Okay, so why don't we shoot to be back in about 10 minutes, let's say, 5 till.
Certainly. Thank you.
And hello. Looks like we are recording, so I think I can go back on the record and just to verify, no one in the room, council chambers. Okay. Great. So we're just going back on the record. We just took a short break, and at the conclusion of our first portion of the hearing, we had heard from the applicant's witnesses they were going to call on. And so I had asked Attorney Heather Burgess, representing the applicant, to give a sort of argument, as it were, as to why the applicant has met its burden in their mind of the criteria for the various permits related to this project. So with that, we'll go to Attorney Burgess. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Mr. Examiner. So I'd like to start just by framing this in a little bit of context. I think it's always challenging, and this is true, I think, for a project applicant as well as for staff, much less the examiner, when you're reviewing an application that is addressing after the fact permitting, because rather than configure a project to meet the approval criteria, you are evaluating the existing improvements in light, kind of forensically, and applying the criteria to determine what can or cannot be retained. And I think that's always a bit more complex analysis. And I appreciate staff's efforts in particular to try to segregate the different elements in a way that, allows for that logical analysis. Making things more complicated, this particular compliance effort started before COVID, was interrupted in a variety of ways by COVID in terms of ability to move forward with the applications, and challenges in obviously being able to prepare and submit materials in the midst of a pandemic. And so we've had some more delay and more passage of time than might be the case for other similar enforcement or after the fact applications. The benefit of that, though, is that you can now see what the property is in its current 2022 state from 2 days ago, compared to when the initial activities took place. And so that can prove beneficial, but I also think it's provided some challenges in terms of creating the record and moving forward with the applications. And the applicants have been slowed at times, but generally diligent in trying to move forward with those activities in compliance with the city's request. So I just want to phrase the context here at the outset of my remarks by, at times this can be like putting a square peg in a round hole and seeing if it will fit. So I'd like to start, and I'm going to follow kind of the organizational structure that Ms. Seymour laid out in her staff report. And she has a very helpful summary on page 17 in a neat little box that I'm going to refer to kind of for cross-reference purposes. There you have it. I thought you might, just so that I'm tracking along with the different elements that were analyzed. So the first issue that presents itself is the bulkhead. And so we presented evidence today, including the email from Ms. Joyner, who's lived adjacent to this property since at least 1979, that there has been an existing bulkhead on the property. Traditionally, under Shoreline Management Act, dating back preceding the current Shoreline Master Program for the city of Lacey, but going back to its original adoptions in the 1970s, a bulkhead for a single family residence would have been exempt. So from a shoreline substantial development permit requirement, and so we wouldn't necessarily expect to see corresponding permit records. We're hampered, as Mr. Callender pointed out, by the lack of clear photo evidence about the nature and character of the bulkhead. But we do have testimony that was presented in the record that at the time that the current property owners and applicants acquired the property, that the bulkhead at issue was made of rock, and that they made efforts to repair and replace that, as opposed to constructing an entirely new replacement bulkhead. Unfortunately, there's some lack of clarity in our record on that, for which we apologize, but we think that's what the evidence supports. And if that's the case, then it should be considered, even though it's all part of the same application, so you have approval authority for it. We believe that that's an otherwise exempt activity and wouldn't be subject to a shoreline conditional use permit application. We note that the Department of Ecology does not recommend removal of the bulkhead, that would not produce an or in its current condition, that would not produce an ecological benefit. And we have already, as part of this compliance effort, proposed extensive restoration in this area, including overhanging and other vegetation that's consistent with current best available science for shoreline management. We believe that the bulkhead does not need to meet conditional use permit replacement criteria, can be retained as an exempt structure, and does not require any additional vegetation or revision to the vegetation management plan beyond what's been proposed. The gravel fill is the second element. This is complicated in my view because, again, you know, at the outset, I mentioned the difficulty sometimes with working with after the fact remarks. The gravel fill was placed behind the bulkhead as part of the stabilization effort and the repair and replacement. We don't have a good quantity. We have testimony that it's providing a benefit and is not harmful to the adjacent, you know, to the aquatic life. And again, we have extensive restoration proposed in this area. So we don't believe that the variance criteria here would be very difficult to meet, but I'm not sure that we have sufficient information to trigger the variance requirement here other than associated with repair and maintenance of the existing bulkhead structure. So we believe it should be retained, but subject to the restoration. Perhaps some additional mill excavation in that area could be ordered if the examiner feels that that's necessary to meet appropriate city codes and conditions. The third item is the pathway. Yes, sir.
Can I just question just a couple things there? Because those appear to be grouped together from what you're saying. So essentially, it's the applicant's position that the bulkhead plus the gravel fill would be exempt traditionally. Let me start there. Is that right? So there's an exemption for normal repair of the bulkhead that you believe is applicable. Is that accurate?
That's correct. That the fill, as it's characterized, was not placed as an independent activity, that it was done in conjunction with the normal maintenance repair of the bulkhead.
Okay, so the applicant's position essentially would be, I should find that the bulkhead with the repair of the bulkhead, including use of the gravel fill, falls within an allowable exemption under the city's SMP. Alternatively, if I determine it did not, if I was to look at this, I guess one thought is the bulkhead would theoretically require, I believe, a SCUP or SCUP, but is it then the applicant's position that I shouldn't parse out the gravel fill, that was actually part of the bulkhead repair, so that it should be analyzed jointly as opposed to with a separate variance? I'm just trying to wrap my mind around what the ask is.
Right. That's where we go back to square peg, round hole. And
Right.
I believe Ms. Seymour did a commendable job in trying to explain that. But we believe what the applicant did in placing the gravel was associated with stabilizing and the bulkhead, which we believe was a maintenance and repair activity. So rather than apply the separate variance criteria for the fill, if it should determine, the examiner should determine whether or not the improvements to the bulkhead were normal maintenance and repair inclusive of the additional fill material. And we believe that there was normal maintenance and repair. If it wasn't, we'd be applying conditional use permit criteria, shoreline conditional use permit criteria, to determine whether it was an authorized replacement. I think it doesn't meet the reality is that what's there on the ground today does not meet the criteria for that. So if the examiner were to reach that conclusion, then it would have to be theoretically, it would have to be removed. I don't know any way around that intellectually.
Sure.
To be, and I don't want my clients to think I'm arguing that that's exactly what's supposed to happen. I'm trying to respond to the hearing examiner's inquiry in that regard.
Well, I agree that this is intellectually very challenging. We've got Department of Ecology essentially saying, the bulkhead, we believe, according to Ecology, they think it would be worse to remove it at this point. The city's view is that, an after the fact SCUP would likely be appropriate, even if, ecology wants it to remain. But the criteria, unless I'm overthinking it, the criteria for a shoreline variance would be different than for an SCUP. So what I'm saying is, theoretically, one way to intellectually look at this would be that the gravel fill and bulkhead are one thing that requires an after the fact SCUP, as opposed to a separate shoreline variance related to the gravel fill itself.
Yes, I agree.
Okay. So that was my question. And I'm not sure anyone has said this other than me just now. I'm just trying to think through kind of what the options are and what makes sense, et
Right.
cetera. So if I were to intellectually view it that way, am I correct in thinking the applicant would not have an issue with that? Obviously, you would prefer me to say this is exempt, under the SMP, so I don't need to deal with it. But if I change, if I do say, no, I think an SCUP was necessary, the analysis would combine those two things instead of parsing them out. Is
Right.
that?
Yes, whether you apply normal maintenance and repair provision or SCUP, either way, it's a singular, in our view, it's a singular activity. So you should
Meaning
apply
The gravel
the
fill and the
gravel fill
bulkhead.
and the bulkhead.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's one
Okay.
activity. So whether
Okay.
whichever criteria you apply to that, it's one activity and not requiring a separate variance for the gravel fill.
There we go. Okay. So thank you. Sorry to interrupt. And I'll get Ms. Seymour's thoughts at the end too, but I think those were the first two things. So now you were about to move on to the pathway, I believe.
I was gonna move on to the pathway. So staff report concludes that we required a conditional use permit for the grading and the substantial development permit for the restoration. I think we have ample evidence in the record that the pathway was existing. The applicant did admit they used it, to move heavy equipment down. That's reflected in Ms. Seymour's staff report. But there was testimony provided that they didn't actually engage in, grading of the area other than the movement of the heavy equipment. And it's since been restored with grasses, and has proposed for restoration and with the vegetation management plan. So I think we actually have agreement with the city staff regarding the shoreline substantial development permit for the vegetation restoration in that area. So we agree on that point. It's just not clear to the applicant that a CUP is also required. We believe this was an existing path that was utilized in a way that created the conditions that shown in their staff report, but that no improvements were done that required an after the fact conditional use permit. And its current condition clearly does not.
Got it. Okay. So for the pathway, don't believe that an SCUP was required, because again, no significant, grading, fill, et cetera. This was an existing pathway. We had the testimony that yes, compaction occurred, but no sort of cutting, of the hillside, et cetera. But also the applicant agrees that an after the fact SSDP would be appropriate. And under that SSDP, the sort of restoration of this, including other aspects of the project, would occur. Is that an accurate assessment?
That's right. Yeah, the restoration plan that's part of the SSDP includes this area in part because of the loss of trees that was referenced in the microburst. So
Got it.
there was,
Okay.
and the knotweed removal. It's all overlapping in that
Yeah.
regard. I'm gonna skip the dock for a minute. I'm gonna go to the patio.
Okay.
So the cement patio, I agree with staff, is subject to a variance. As the examiner knows, the variance criteria under the Shoreline Master Program are somewhat onerous. We have provided, and in the updated version of the geotechnical report from Quality Geo, I would recommend or ask the examiner to give careful consideration to the discussion of the patio that appears on page 3 of the revised report, which adds a sentence or two specifically addressing what the anticipated next steps would be in the event that the patio is removed. Mr. Calendar's testimony gave a sort of preview to this. So if you remove the concrete patio, it still seems evident, and it's supported by the evidence, that some other stabilization is going to be required. in that area because the patio is in its current formation, serving and kind of is contiguous with somewhat of a retaining wall. And there may be additional slope stabilization, and Ms. Gus's testimony and photos made evident that there's going to be some additional hillside stabilization required over time. So removing the patio to the extent that that's required because of the shoreline variance criteria is not going to eliminate the need for further permitting, which would probably include a variance because of its proximity to the shoreline for stabilization to occur in that area. So whether it's a patio or a wall, the same criteria are ultimately going to apply to what needs to happen in this shoreline. So it's
That's the sort of the bookend problem, I think, is the way Ms. Gusta described it well, where, you know, it's stopping other books. I think that's how she described it, but I think I understand, certainly.
Right. To the extent that the examiner does conclude that the variance criteria cannot be met to retain the patio and that some or all of it is required to be removed, which is a condition that's noted in the staff suggested conditions of approval on page 18 of the staff report. We just, I do think it would be, rather than, as I mentioned at the beginning, rather than wait until subsequent to a decision, we would prefer to submit a condition specifically addressing and a timeline in particular for removing that patio. We'd like to do a post-hearing submittal for Mr. Callender that would enable us to propose specific condition and vegetation addressing the removal. Ms. Gusta has fairly significant concerns about how that can be accomplished in a way that isn't going to, you know, realizing they did it without the permit. We don't want to further compromise the integrity of the slope, nor do we want to be doing work that is going to contribute to the spread of knotweed in that area. And so it's fairly detailed sequencing, as I understand it, from Mr. Callender that would need to take place in order to accomplish that removal. So we'd like to submit that specific condition so that in the event that's ordered by the examiner, that condition can be approved now, as opposed to creating a dispute potentially later with the city and enforcement of the conditions.
So I guess to clarify that just a little bit, essentially the concern is, were I to find that the patio wouldn't meet the criteria for a shoreline variance, sorry. Can you hear me okay? I apologize.
I can.
A
Yep.
vacuum start somewhere outside. The idea being, if the patio is removed, there's concern that stabilization measures, retaining wall or something might be required. Is it that might also require a shoreline variance or a shoreline conditional use permit? That's my first question. Did I understand that right, Ms. Burgess?
Well, so part one of this is that's my overarching concern, right? No matter what we put down there, it's going to require a shoreline variance. That is possible. I anticipate the way that the staff report currently proposes conditions of approval, it's a condition that we submit a revised restoration plan showing the removal within 30 days of the conclusion of, after the appeal periods have run, but without being specific. And I would prefer that as to the removal of the patio feature, that we get a condition of approval that lays out the timeline and process for that removal as part of this decision, rather than inviting an opportunity for later dispute over the over the later plan.
Well,
I imagine there's going to be temporary erosion control and some other features of that condition. I'm not proposing submitting a follow-on variance application for any specific feature.
okay, that was my question. So I understand timing wise, it would be ideal to say, if the patio is being removed, we already know this needs to happen, but I don't know if the work has been done to tell us that.
Right.
Okay, so unfortunately, if I determine that the patio hasn't met the criteria and it needs to go, there's a two-step process, it sounds like. Step one would be, how is it removed and what's the timeline? you would like the record to stay open long enough to submit something that addresses that. But then theoretically, there will end up being a step 2, which will be another hearing likely in another application
It's
related.
Yeah,
Possibly. We
it's
don't know.
possible. We don't know that right now.
Okay,
But my main concern is having a condition on the removal that allows, because the methods that need to be used to remove it are, we have to do some hand removal, we have to do some knotweed. I just don't want to be in a situation where there's an expectation that everything's going to be out of there within 30 days or something, because it's just not going to be feasible to do that. So
Got it.
we want to make a specific proposal in the event to address the patio in the event that the examiner decides that it does not meet the variance criteria.
okay. So what I would say is, in your mind, shelf that for 1 second. Let's finish. We'll go to Samra Seymour, and then maybe at the end we can talk about next steps. Does that work for you?
That works. And then I don't have any additional argument to offer with respect to the dock.
Okay. So then I think that, and we have agreement on the VMA restoration, correct?
Yes.
To the extent that obviously it'll be contingent on whatever I decide, but yes. Okay. Great. Anything final before I then see what Samra Seymour has to say now that we've heard this?
No, other than except as noted with respect to the patio removal, we have no objection to the conditions of approval as reflected on page 18.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so Ms. Seymour, thank you. And I guess, yeah, well, why don't you start and I'll ask questions as they come up in my mind.
Okay. I think I can summarize sort of city's position fairly quickly. I don't think that, so the city doesn't or the city agrees that containing the knotweed and figuring out a mitigation plan for that, as well as the need for slope stabilization on the entire site. It is a challenging site. There's lots of things that need to be done on the site, and that the steps the applicant has already taken to do that. We don't disagree about any of that. The city's position has always been, though, it just needed to be done through the appropriate permits, through the appropriate process, and this is what this was, an attempt to do those. I would also point out that there really is only a very limited number of things that you can do in that 50-foot setback area without some type of permit, whether it's an exemption, a conditional use permit, or a substantial development permit. Even tree removal in the vegetation management area is highly regulated and requires permits. So even trees that have already come down, technically speaking, trees that come down in the vegetation management area are required to be felled into the area and left there. So I bring that up just as a point to show that it's a very regulated area. There's not a lot you can do. So even bringing heavy equipment into the area is a regulated, So one of the things that it's difficult to sort of parse out is the Shorelines Management Act talks about, or our Shorelines Management Program, does talk about grading and fill and regulates it with the CUP. But when you go to the section that talks specifically about the development standards for that, it's talking about, it regulates fill. It doesn't really talk about or define really what grading is. And the city's position is that when they take the heavy equipment into that area, and you start moving around dirt, whether you're bringing in fill or whether you're doing cut, that you're altering the surface, and that triggers triggers regulation. That's where the city's argument that a conditional use permit would have been required is just there was site disturbing activity in that 50-foot vegetation management area. If it had been properly permitted before the fact, we probably would have permitted all of that activity through a shoreline substantial development permit that looked at how do we handle the knotweed in a vegetation management area? How do we deal with the slope stabilization and the erosion issues that are, like I said, are definitely applicable on this site.
And in my mind, that discussion you just had would be
Mhm.
the restoration of that 50-foot VMA and the pathway both. Is that right?
Mhm. Yes, yeah, yeah, correct. Um, let's see, lost my train of thought. So I think the other thing that came up for me when I was listening to Ms. Burgess closing sort of summation is I think the city's intent with requiring the patio or recommending the patio removal and then additional work that might come of that is not that we would be back here in another 3 months or whatever for another permit. I don't think that we want to do that. I think we want to try to wrap everything into this permitting process as well. And so I think what if the hearings examiner were to determine that the patio should be removed, the additional analysis that would need to be done to determine what type of slope stabilization would be appropriate, as well as any other mitigation for the site disturbance could be considered under a shoreline substantial development permit as part of that ecological restoration that's being sought for the overall project. And further, just to clarify, our suggested condition of approval wasn't that the patio be removed in 30 days. I don't think we want to see the patio removed in 30 days, probably not during the wet season. We know that that's a very sensitive area and we don't want to be moving dirt around in that area. I think the intent of that 30-day time period was really to try to get a plan in place, including a phasing plan, possibly with timing in terms of when are those improvements going to occur. We just want to make sure that once we do have a final determination on it, that we start moving forward in a timely manner. So that's where that time frame came from. I think that's all. That's all the thoughts I had. I'm happy to answer any questions that came up for you as well.
Sure. Well, in terms of the bulkhead, just to clarify, the city's position is that under the definitions, even assuming it was always a rock bulkhead, not
Mhm.
concrete, is it that it was replacement, not repair, because of a certain threshold or how much work, that kind of a thing? Or can you just quickly touch on
Sure.
that?
Yeah. Thank you. Actually, I did miss that step. So the city's standpoint on is on the bulkhead is, like I said, originally it sounded like it was repaired, and that would have, based on what I had read in the applicant's submission, and that certainly would have been clearly a conditional use permit. If in fact it was repair work, it would have needed to meet that specific threshold for 50% or less than the replacement value. And that is the information that we were denied the ability to review. So typically, if somebody comes to us and they want to repair their bulkhead, they would need to come to us with some paperwork from a shoreline stabilization expert, showing these are the plans for repair. This is the cost we would be looking at for a full replacement, but this is the amount of the repair. So we would be able to clearly look at those two costs and make the determination if the bulkhead repair was falling underneath that 50% replacement value. Since we didn't have the opportunity to do that, staff couldn't really make the determination that it would have been exempt. And so therefore we defaulted back to, well, it would be subject to a conditional use permit and the mitigation sequencing, applicable mitigation sequencing after that.
Okay. And then the gravel fill, you heard me struggling with how to think through, does city staff have any thoughts on?
Well, I think the way that the way that the gravel fill seemed to be presented in Exhibit 4 was that it was largely for knotweed control. And, based on comments from Department of Ecology, as well as staff's review of some of the literature from Department of Natural Resource, gravel fill wasn't mentioned as a mitigation method or a control method for knotweed. So that was our analysis was based on that, not as part of, not part of the bulkhead. And again, because the bulkhead work was done without city review, it's one of those situations where, it's hard to make a determination as to whether that was appropriate. We did provide some aerial photography that shows, adding of fill to areas that appeared to be underwater at some point, which is pretty clearly prohibited by the Shoreline Master Program. So again, didn't have the opportunity to review that, but typically would be a CUP with following the mitigation sequencing.
Okay. There's certainly a lot going on. The challenge for me, to be perfectly frank, is even how do I categorize the ask, to the extent that, the implications are significant. If I treat the bulkhead and gravel fill together, that's different than if I treat them separately. If I determine that the bulkhead falls within the exemption, that would be different, right? Than otherwise, is it a CUP versus a shoreline variance? There are implications there, so almost for each one of these things, there are implications in terms of what my review criteria are, and so it is a challenge for me, and I know the implications are significant for the property owner. They've clearly put time and effort into the work and the property, and that is, I don't want to be flippant about the way I approach this. I want to make sure that due consideration and thought has been given. From a process standpoint, also, ultimately, am I correct that after my decision, this goes to council? Is that the next step?
Most
Still?
likely, yes.
Okay,
Yes.
but then even after that, if either an SCUP or an shoreline variance are involved, final sign off is from ecology, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, and then to that end, do we know, and maybe Ms. Burgess is the best person, but are there other jurisdictional permits that are involved at the moment in HPA? Nothing to that. Okay, it's just.
No, we didn't apply for HPA or anything, and we did not apply for an HPA. So there's no other permits that are pending other than what's in front of you.
So I just want to make sure I think this through. I guess one thought I had would be perhaps it would be appropriate to leave the record open for staff and the applicant to have, a final powwow, as it were, to see if there's any agreement on some of these sort of things that were, I think, confusing leading up to the hearing. I think we're all learning right now, if that's helpful, and then I can get either an additional staff memorandum might be helpful along with the applicant memorandum. Even if you all don't end up agreeing, I almost feel like knowing that what you're not agreeing on more specifically might be helpful. But is that your thoughts on that, Sam or Seymour? I'm not trying to make more work for everyone. But it's an iterative process normally, and here it's extra weird because we're almost going backward in terms of after the fact. But I just want to make sure I'm not misunderstanding or mischaracterizing or taking missteps in terms of how I think and review things. And it would be helpful if, at a minimum, the parties agree on what is being asked, so that I know how to analyze it, as it were, which sort of, path I go down. Does that make sense? I'm not, again, trying to make things more difficult, but I am trying to avoid more work further down the road, as it were.
Yeah, no, I certainly understand what you're trying to do. And trust me, it was a very challenging project to try to wrap my head around procedurally, you know, what the ask was. I hear what you're saying. And I mean, I don't think that the city is necessarily opposed to having another discussion with the applicants to you know, to do that if the applicant thinks that would be helpful. I mean, we would certainly, you know, we're always willing to have those discussions. So.
Well, I only say that to the extent that there's clearly been some discussion today that I think shed some light on things, to the extent that, you know, the thought I think that the city had up until today was that the bulkhead, you know, based on the reports, the bulkhead was concrete and then replaced with rock. And, you know, now we have testimony, well, no, that really wasn't the case. And then we've had discussion on the purpose and function to some extent of this gravel fill was part of the bulkhead repair as opposed to just knotweed maintenance. So it's these types of things that are sort of making me struggle with, you know, how to intellectualize what I am supposed to be doing. And I just want to make sure I'm not misunderstanding. So, but if nothing really has changed, I can go to work as needed.
Yeah, I don't know that anything really from the city has changed, at least in terms of the bulkhead. It sounds like it may have been, you know, it wasn't a full replacement, like I said, as I had thought maybe it was, but I still don't know. And I assume that the applicants would have provided the evidence if they had it, that, you know, as to the costs of this at the time in order to show that they met that exemption. So short of that type of evidence to be able to make that determination, I don't know that staff's analysis has really changed.
Okay. Any thoughts there, Heather Burgess?
Well, I mean, I think the challenging thing with this project has been that it came out of this kind of code compliance posture. And so we submitted after the fact applications in response to that, but we didn't really go because of that. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with this. We didn't really go through an iterative project review process on this, where normally you'd propose something and then you get staff comments about, you can do this, you can do that. So I'm not sure until we saw the staff report and had the hearing that we appreciated some of the staff's positions on a couple of these permits in terms of what the analysis would be. So I'd like the opportunity to hold the record open to try to provide some additional evidence of value if that would be useful to the examiner. That's not something that we had discussed. So we can certainly take a look at that and see if we can provide some additional evidence in support of that technical piece of the exemption. I think, you know, I can't go back in time and undo it and present it beforehand. We can certainly provide a value of what the materials were that were placed to show that we're below whatever the threshold was. I'm not sure how meaningful that is as an exercise because we're kind of engaging in some speculation about the scope and extent of what was there before. But if that would be useful, I mean, I think there has been testimony that, you know, they kind of did these things themselves and they used extra cement. You know, there was not a lot of contracting activity going on, but I can certainly provide some additional information about that if that would be useful in a post-hearing submission to amplify that point. I mean, I do think we have general agreement, and ecology appears to agree, which is what's important to me as the end decider on a shoreline conditional use permit, that it's better to leave the bulkhead in place than it is to remove it. For ecological reasons, and that we're doing the vegetation and the planting that's necessary to support that. So I think we have agreement on that aspect of it, Mr. Examiner, which is useful, I think, as a starting point for that particular issue.
Yeah, I guess on some level that the ecology's comments, I also agree are you know, in my mind, really important to the extent that A, they're the jurisdiction with final say, but B, they certainly have more expertise than I do. I guess the whether the gravel fill should be considered part of it or not, I think that issue is a challenge because A, I think removing it's going to be challenging in and of itself, but B, also, do I do a separate analysis of a shoreline variance just on that gravel fill versus is it wrapped into however I think of the bulkhead? That particular, I keep getting hung up on that because it is, in my mind, going to be a real sort of sticky, challenging thing to think through. Okay.
I'm not sure I can help you there other than.
Yeah,
what we
no,
were-
I know.
I wish I could, but I don't,
Same.
not sure there's much more that I could do other than to say that, it was kind of all done. Oh, Mr. Joyner has
I'd have a
something.
thought.
Okay, go right ahead.
Do I have to get sworn in really quick or just like,
Yeah, let's do
Okay,
that. Do you
gotcha.
swear affirm to tell the truth and testimony you give here today?
I do?
And could you just state and spell your name for us?
Ian Joyner, first name E-A-N, last name J-O-Y-N-E-R.
Thank you, Mr. Joyner. Go ahead.
All right, so two parts to the gravel on the bulkhead. One, the gravel's helping retain the soily, soft sand that's down there from eroding between the bulkhead and the concrete, or the bulkhead and the lake. That's part of it. So it helps with the erosion control. The part that Alex is talking about as far as the knotweed control, I don't know if you've ever heard, read, or researched anything about knotweed, but I've done a lot. I will tell you that. Knotweed spreads like wildfire. The moment you scrape out that gravel and you put it somewhere else, you're disturbing that knotweed, whether it's the root or even just a piece of a leaf. If you cut it with a lawnmower, that knotweed will spread just from the leaf being cut off there. So if you remove that gravel and put it somewhere else, and obviously that gravel is going to have to go to a different part of the property or the landfill or some other piece of property that somebody else owns to dispose of, you're spreading that knotweed. So if you do the research on knotweed, there's two ways to do it. You have to burn it when you dig it all out. If you dig it out, you have to burn it, and or you have to lay it out on big pieces of black visqueen for months on end till it dies and hope that the wind doesn't carry it off. And if that happens, then it's just a bad thing. This knotweed is really nasty. So my opinion, Alex is part of the helping to control the knotweed with the gravel being left there is by not digging it out. Because if you dig it out, that root base spreads even further and we get more pop-ups all over the place. What we kill ends up popping up in different areas. And it's just a constant battle. We're just fighting this stuff constantly.
No, I thank you. I get it. So an additional thought in terms of, requiring gravel removal creates the risk of spreading knotweed because there's knotweed, detritus, leaves, seeds, etc., that is now already within that gravel. So if you take it anywhere else, the risk runs.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I certainly understand.
You can see on the pathway going down to the lake, the brown spots in the grass are dead spots from spraying the knotweed. So the knotweed is popping up in those areas. Even when you look up the stairway going towards the house and you see those ecology blocks up on the hill helping stabilize the slope back up there, because we had to do that for erosion control, which Samra can testify from the pictures that we had sent her 2-3 years ago, whatever time frame that was, when we had heavy rains, our hillside started coming down. And we had to do an emergency permit to get the ecology blocks in there. And that was a fight just to get those blocks
Got
to
it.
stabilize the hill, which were outside the 50-foot buffer zone. But
Sure.
even up there in the ecology block area and that grass area, we have knotweed that we're fighting up there constantly. And we're spraying the ground and we're spraying the grass and it's killing all that area. And they're popping up in multiple different spots. So it's just going to be a battle. And I do not recommend removing, I do not recommend removing the gravel because we're going to spread it in other areas of our property. And I do not recommend removing the concrete because we're going to have to take heavy equipment down there to remove it. And just doing that down the pathway and disturbing the soil, we're just going to spread more stuff all over the place. It's not worth it.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mr. Joyner. Okay, so, okay. Happy to hear from Mr. Joyner, but it did throw me off in terms of where my mind was at. So give me 1 sec. I'm just trying to think through where I was. Okay, so I think ultimately, Ms. Burgess, you were hoping to have the record left open, but let's be clear on to what extent. It sounds as if maybe an additional meeting might not be helpful. That's fine. But in your mind, what additional information would you
Right.
hope to provide, and how long, do you need to produce that information, et cetera?
Sure. But based on Ms. Seymour's clarifying comments about the the condition of approval, the timing of the condition of approval, and the scope and extent of what can be in the restoration plan regarding the removal of the patio and maybe the shoreline stabilization being undertaken as part of the approved restoration plan. I'm not sure I have the same concern about needing to submit the condition now.
Okay,
In other words, her clarification about what was intended by the condition and the submittal of the plan addresses that concern. I think we will be able to work through the timing and the other issues that I was concerned about if that's the city's position on the restoration plan. So although I think I've said it twice now that I wanted it to be kept open to propose the condition, I don't think that's actually necessary based on Ms. Seymour's additional clarifying remarks.
okay. So no need to leave the record open. The evidence I have, you believe, is sufficient for me to make a determination as to all the various requests. Is that accurate? I don't want to put words in your mouth.
That is, it's what I have to give you
Okay.
or to address those various requests. So yes, that's
And
accurate.
Sarah Seymour, any final thoughts then on behalf of the city?
No, I think we're good.
Okay, just to check one final time, we didn't end up with any members of the public in the room. I'm getting the sad and lonely no. Okay. Okay, well, it is certainly complicated and a lot for me to think about. But in terms of the record, just to be clear on where we ended up, I believe we had the 2 additional applicant exhibits this morning, which put us at F and G, exhibits 10, A through G. Exhibit 11 is going to be the PowerPoint that Mr. Callender used. And I think those are the exhibits, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So then the record can close. We'll make sure I get a copy of the PowerPoint, but we'll go ahead and close the record at the end of the hearing today. And I'll just have to make the determination as to what relates to what, and I am certainly, happy to do so. It is clearly a lot going on and very complicated, and I will try to be as clear as possible. Even the decisions I produce that are not well beloved in Lacey tend to be really long, so hopefully it'll at least be clear on what relates to what, so that everyone is able to determine what next steps are. So I thank everyone. I know it's been a long day today, but this morning, but thank you for taking the time to participate, to answer questions. I think we can end our hearing, and I'll seek to produce a decision here in the next couple of weeks on the various requests that are part of today's hearing. And so with that, I think we can conclude today's hearing. Thank you, Ms. Burgess. Thank you to our applicants. Thank you to city staff, and wish everyone safety and good health. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.